So I'm sure you guys may have seen that there is a new shooter in town. It is called XDEFIANT and it is made by Ubisoft. It is a free-to-play shooter that is currently in its open beta. And today I pretty much just wanted to go over all of my thoughts after probably 4 to 5 hours of playtime so far. Pretty much tried a bunch of different weapons on all the different modes and maps. And I feel like I've got a pretty good feeling for the game. So without wasting any time, let's get stuck right into it. If you guys do want to see some more XDEFIANT content as we get closer to launch, be sure to let me know. It is a very fun game. And like I said, it is free to play. So if you guys are interested, be sure to let me know down below. Now, my first impressions of the gunplay and just the gameplay in general is that it does feel very fun and very smooth. Obviously, any brand new IP when it comes to first-person shooters, they do have pretty big shoes to fill because they are going up against the games like Call of Duty and Battlefield and all of these games that have been established for a very long time. They've been around since pretty much before any of us can really even remember at this point. And so to launch a new shooter in 2023, it's not an easy thing to do, but I honestly do think that they've actually done a really good job here. Like I said, the gunplay feels very solid. It does feel very similar to Call of Duty, so if you guys are Call of Duty fans, then you will probably like XDEFIANT. And even if you are a Battlefield fan and not so much a Call of Duty fan, one thing that Call of Duty has always done as good, if not potentially better than Battlefield, is probably the gunplay. That is somewhere that Call of Duty generally does tend to shine, and like I said, the gunplay in this game does feel very similar to Call of Duty. Now, with that being said, I will say it feels a little bit like dated already, which is weird because obviously the game isn't even out yet. To say it feels dated doesn't really make sense, but the game kind of feels as though it's like a, I don't know, 2017 shooter rather than a 2023 shooter. It doesn't by any means feel bad, but it just doesn't feel quite as like crisp and smooth as Call of Duty and Battlefield's gunplay do. Even down to games like Apex, for example, it doesn't quite reach that bracket of gameplay. But again, this is a brand new IP. This is their first time actually making a shooter too. And so to compare it to those games and say it's not quite as good, that's probably to be expected, to be honest. It would be pretty amazing if this game came out and it had gameplay that was already exactly as good as those games. So for me personally, I can feel a very slight difference between those really established IPs and XDEFIANT. But the fact that I'm even comparing them, I think is actually a positive for this game because, like I said, it's pretty crazy they've just launched a brand new game and it feels like it can be in the discussion with those top shooters. Now, one thing that differentiates this game a lot from Call of Duty, because like I said, the gameplay is almost identical in a lot of ways, but the biggest differentiation is the faction system. Obviously, in a game like Call of Duty, you pretty much just choose your class and go. There's no real difference between my player versus your player other than the loadout that we're carrying. But in this game, there are different factions. There are currently 5 in the game and there will be more coming with each season. Something else that is cool is that all of these factions are actually based off of other Ubisoft games. So there are games like Watch Dogs, Far Cry, for example. Some of those games and factions from those games are actually in this game. So it's almost like a little crossover, or almost like a Ubisoft multiverse, if that makes sense. So not only is that really cool, but then the actual gameplay mechanics of it is really, really solid. Each faction has their own ability system. Every single faction has its own ultimate, but then even within each faction, you can actually choose your own ability. There are 2 different options, and I'm gonna say they'll probably add more down the line as well. And so even if you and I pick the same character, we can actually have different abilities with the same ultimate. And then you also have a trait which is, again, very similar to, for example, Battlefield, or specifically 2042, that there are traits, so it's almost like a passive ability that's going on at all times. Like I said, I do think this is a really cool addition to this game. It does differentiate it from COD, because without this, I do think it would be pretty much just a poor man's COD, unfortunately. But because of this system, it does actually add something that is very different from that game. It's almost like a cross between like Call of Duty and maybe Overwatch or a game like that, where it is almost like ability based, almost a little bit of a hero shooter, but not quite on that level. And yeah, I think that is a really, really cool system that they've put into the game. Now, I also think the map design is fairly solid for the most part. I think on most modes, it is actually laid out really well. The map design does feel very similar to some of the older Call of Duties, and I'm talking like Black Ops, maybe even Modern Warfare 2, as in the original Modern Warfare 2. You can tell that it's kind of inspired by Call of Duty in terms of the way that a lot of these maps are laid out. Not to say that they're directly copying from those maps, but the typical 3-lane system that used to work really well in Call of Duty, where there's kind of like the middle lane and that's where most of the action is, but then there's kind of a flank on each side, a couple of little hidey holes and stuff like that scattered throughout the map. It does feel sort of similar and based off of that like system that they used to use for Call of Duty, which unfortunately went out the window, and for me is pretty much why I don't enjoy Call of Duty anymore, because the maps are absolutely terrible. Now, with that being said, although I do think it works pretty well for most modes, I will will say the escort maps that I've played so far, they seem a little bit off to me in their design. I can't actually put a finger on it though, so I don't have any genuine like criticism as to why I don't really like them. Maybe it's just because I'm not really used to them. I'm not too sure, but some of the escort maps do feel just kind of weirdly laid out. It's almost like there are certain parts of the map that don't even really need to be there, for example, and there are some parts where it's like too chaotic and you can't ever get through there. So I don't think the map design is absolutely perfect, but I do think it is far better than the recent Call of Duty games, and I think they've done that on purpose. It's been one of the biggest complaints in Call of Duty for the last few years now, and for those who don't know, Mark Rubin, who is I believe the producer of this game, he used to work on Call of Duty, and he's actually been really like constantly tweeting over the last year or so, saying how this game is going to be kind of like taking the good elements of the old Call of Duty games and putting them into this game while not having the similar issues that the current Call of Duty games have, like skill-based matchmaking and the poor map design and all that kind of thing. And so I do think they've kind of like picked the best parts of the old Call of Duty games, put them in this game, and then added their own flair to it. So that is definitely, at least so far, a recipe for success. Now, in terms of some of the issues that I have with the game, and obviously keep in mind it's in beta, so we can't fully judge it just yet, but some of these are the type of issues that potentially could be fixed by the launch, but I don't think they probably will be, so they are still, I think, valid criticisms. One, the headshot multiplier is absolutely freaking mental. It feels as though if you land a headshot, it's a one-shot kill. It's not obviously to that extent, but that is sometimes how it feels. Not only on my end, sometimes I'm just one-shotting people with a freaking SMG, it feels like, but then also on the flip side, sometimes it'll feel like I just get killed immediately, when the rest of the gunfights, if both of us are shooting at each other's body, the actual time to kill is really solid. I actually kind of like the slower time to kill that this game has, but yeah, sometimes I'll be shooting at their body, I won't miss a single shot, and they will just hit me once and I'll die, and vice versa. So I think they need to turn the headshot multiplier down just a little bit. I do think any game needs a headshot multiplier. It should be rewarded if you can land shots to the head, but it pretty much feels like it is borderline a one-shot kill with pretty much any gun in the game. It's not literally like that, but I do think there are a lot of weapons where you can actually hit one headshot and then maybe one or two shots to the body, and that is a kill, when with that same weapon it might take 5 to 6 shots to the body to kill. So that is definitely one issue that I'm having, and it is making a lot of gunfights a little bit frustrating because there's times when I won't miss a single shot and I'm just dying immediately. Another issue that I have is to do with the movement. I think overall the movement is fairly solid, but I do think it feels a little bit sticky in some cases, and by that I mean it's not really like super fluid. So you'll go into the slide, for example, and then it kind of feels like it's almost like realistic, like where if you're on one knee and then you've got to get up and you're carrying a weapon, it's going to be hard to get up and just start sprinting straight away. So in that sense it is realistic, but this is meant to be a fast-paced arcade shooter. If I enter the slide, I shouldn't have to then be like slowly running for about 2 seconds before I hit full speed again. And so that's what I mean when I say it feels sticky. It pretty much feels like, unless you are just sprinting head first into battle, if you're doing any other actions like jumping or sliding, or even if you're trying to sprint from, you aim down sights and then you quickly turn around and try to run away, it feels like pretty much the acceleration is really slow compared to, for example, a game like Call of Duty, where pretty much as soon as you start sprinting, you are currently sprinting. There's no like slow acceleration into the sprint. It's almost instant, and I think that works well for this type of game. So hopefully they can change up the movement a little bit, but like I said, it's not the worst either. It's not like terrible movement, it's just a little bit sticky in some areas. I do also think that the UI is a little bit like overbearing, I guess. It's kind of taking up a lot of the screen. Now, keep in mind, I haven't looked into the settings to see if you can actually scale it down, so that could be a fix right there, but I do think that any UI that you have to go into the settings and change to make it better, that isn't well-designed UI. You need to have UI that as soon as you load into the game feels comfortable, it's not too glaring and in your face, but also provides all the information that you need. So that one is probably a little bit easier for them to fix because it's not fully like baked into the game. They can obviously change the UI as they go, but yeah, it feels like it is taking up a lot of the screen, and like I said, it kind of that adds to why it feels like a bit of a dated shooter. I feel like a lot of shooters these days have very like clean and sort of simplistic UI for the most part. However, this has kind of gone back to like, it almost looks like Black Ops 2 or like an Overwatch UI, for example, which is, yeah, a little bit outdated these days, I think. Now, really the final issue that I have is to do with the incendiary rounds, and this is actually not an attachment you can choose. This is in one of the factions. It is the passive ability, or I believe the Cleaners, which is the division like faction within the game, and their passive ability is that they have incendiary rounds. Now, that alone as in just specifically the incendiary rounds, that isn't just the main issue. For me, I think any game that has anything like that, where it's like a really annoying feature that only one class can use, for example, I think that is a terrible thing to have. I think it's bad enough having incendiary rounds just as an attachment option. I absolutely hate incendiary rounds in any game, but the fact that it is not even just an attachment, that it's just tied to one class or one faction, I'm very much not a fan of that at all. And like I said, it's not just the incendiary rounds in particular, but they could add more factions in the future and it's going to have similar issues to this, where it may be some other different ability that is kind of annoying that only that class can have. So I do think the game could face a lot of issues with stuff like that. I know that in the past, for example, with Warzone, once people caught onto the incendiary rounds, pretty much every single person was using them, and it made the game for me entirely unplayable. I literally quit Warzone once it got to the Vanguard stage because everyone was running around with incendiary rounds and I just absolutely hate it. So hopefully they take that out or tweak it. I'm not too sure how they'll do it, but little things like that I do have an issue with. I think elements like that should not be in shooters, in my opinion. Overall, the fact that this game is free to play, now obviously it's not out yet, but once it is out, it will be free, and it has a pretty decent amount of content already, even just in the beta, but what they've also confirmed for launch. I believe they said there's 28 weapons and like 14 maps or something like that, and then it is already confirmed to have a solid year of content already planned, with 3 maps, 3 weapons, and a new faction coming every single season, and each season will be lasting 3 months. So that's essentially a new map and a new weapon every single season at the very minimum, plus a bunch of other stuff that they add too. And all of those things in combination, the free to play, the solid amount of content, and just the general pretty good feeling of the gameplay, I do think this game actually has legs. When they first announced it, I honestly thought there's not a chance this game does well. It's going up against games like Call of Duty and stuff like that, but I do think we are in the worst period for first-person shooters, probably in the history of first-person shooters, honestly. And if there's ever a time to launch a brand new IP, it is probably right now. And honestly, this game has been received really well. I personally do really enjoy it. Like I said, I don't think it's perfect. I don't think it quite stacks up to like peak Call of Duty. But the fact that currently Call of Duty is not at its peak, it is probably at its lowest point. I honestly think this game is more enjoyable already just in the beta than Call of Duty is. So, like I said, I think the game does have legs, and the fact that it is free to play is an awesome touch. Pretty much everyone's just going to be able to give it a try, and the good thing with a free-to-play game, if you don't like it, you just delete it. It's so simple, you don't have to worry about spending money on it, and I think that will get a lot of people in the door. So hopefully if they can continue to improve it and just put out a lot of good content, I do think this game will be a really good alternative for us to play while, like I said, Call of Duty and even Battlefield are just not at their peak. I'm keen to hear what you guys think, so be sure to leave your thoughts down below, whether you have played it or even if you haven't played it, whether you think it looks good or not. So be sure to leave your thoughts down below. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll see you all out there on the battlefield.